I'm John Dankosky. Thanks so much for joining us for this special Connecticut Mirror event on the impact of the 2022 election here in the state of Connecticut. I'm joined by a great panel tonight. We're going to be taking some questions from our audience, both here at the beautiful Old State House in Hartford and also online. So hopefully you can join us with some questions in just a little bit. Let me introduce our panelists first. Bilal Sekou is here. He's an associate professor of political science at the Hillier College at the University of Hartford. Go Hawks. And a member of the Mirror's board of directors. Bilal, it's good to see you once again.
Go Hawks. Good to see you also.
Mark Pazniokas, of course, is the Capitol Bureau Chief of the Connecticut Mirror. Mark, good to see you.
Good to see you, John.
Looking good, by the way. And Beth Hamilton is the executive editor of the Connecticut Mirror. Beth, it's always good to see you. Thanks so much for being here.
Thank you.
Well, we've just come through a really interesting election cycle. Maybe not as groundbreaking an election cycle as some people thought it might be. Before we get into some specifics about the governor's race, specifics about the 5th district race, what happened in the Senate race here in Connecticut, and what this might mean for the future of Connecticut. Just big picture, what did you think about this? Beth, when you tell people you've been covering the election now for weeks and weeks and weeks, what were the big takeaways for you?
I suppose that, as usual, Connecticut remained in Democratic control, which I think a lot of people thought would not happen. We on the staff were prepared for any outcome and talked those outcomes through, but ultimately the state of Connecticut did what the state of Connecticut usually does.
Well, and that is weird. I mean, as you plan to cover an election and you think about all the different possibilities, the fact of the matter is that things don't change here very much. There's a reason why it's the land of steady habits. I mean, are you ever surprised by the fact that there's not more surprise?
I am. And as a journalist, sometimes that's a little disappointing just because it's fun to cover change. But at the same time, it's not all that surprising that an incumbent governor was reelected.
Not all that surprising at all. And Mark, you and I have talked about this. How long has it been since an incumbent governor of Connecticut has been unseated?
1954.
You covered that election, I think.
Thank you. Which was also the year that Ned Lamont was born.
Yes.
If you're into numerology and coincidences. But yes, incumbent governors are not unseated in this state. But I mean, there were things that were surprising to me. The turnout in the cities was pretty poor. The governor did not get anywhere close to the votes he got 4 years ago, but yet his margin of victory pretty much quadrupled because the suburbs are changing in Connecticut, or at least they did this cycle. We could chat later about what might be permanent or at least long-lasting and what was a reaction to the issues and the circumstances of the moments. But it was a pretty stunning election to me, given the turnout in the suburbs, how Fairfield County went solidly Democratic. The governor, if you look at the map, we'll get to that later, but I mean, that was, to me, the one surprise. Overall, the polling, we could see the towns that flipped. The ones that flipped are in brown, but yeah, there were 45 towns that Stefanowski won 4 years ago that went for Lamont. And the thing the map doesn't show is a lot of those red towns, the margins that Stefanowski had this time were much tighter. So there is something going on here in the suburbs. And as you can see on the map, I mean, it was pretty much, solid in Lower Fairfield County because the Browns and the Blues are all Lamont's towns, all along the shoreline with the exception of that little sliver that's East Haven, one of the blue-collar towns that had been trending Republican. So that, to me, was, probably the single biggest takeaway of this cycle.
If you don't mind, keep that slide up there, Kyle, because we want to come back to this in just a moment. We also want to come back to some other data visualization that we have that really shows some of that weakening support, perhaps in the cities for Lamont, at least in terms of turnout. Bilal, for you, what are some of the big takeaways for this? Turnout is something that I know you and I have talked about in the past, but what else do you see in this election?
Well, I'll tell you, one of the things I'm surprised about tonight is Mark's ability to look at the map and know where all the towns are at with no names on the map. So, but, beyond that, I think in many ways this, as Beth said, this election really demonstrated just what the power of incumbency actually is. And whether you're looking at the national level or you're looking at the state races, incumbency won. And so that, I think, was really not surprising, given incumbents have a lot of advantage when running for re-election. I think the other thing that stood out to me about this election cycle at the state level was how many races were actually not competitive, in the sense that there was no one running against the candidate who was running for office. There were a lot of people who walked away from office, and there was a lot of open seats as well. But the lack of competition, to me, is really surprising, and I think it's a kind of a black eye on our democracy. And I think the third thing that really struck me about this, of course, was, there was a lot of attention in the state really focused on the national level elections. And, certainly the 5th District was a focal point for a lot of people, as well as the race with Blumenthal, the Senate race. But at the same time, so many decisions are made at the state level that impact people's lives. And so it was interesting the way the media in particular focused on a lot of the national level and really didn't talk enough about the state level and what was going on at the state level.
And that's so interesting, Beth, when you think about how an organization like the Connecticut Mirror covers an election like this and thinks about it, at the national level, there is all this conversation about what the important issues are. And in Connecticut, obviously some of those came into play, but quite a few of them, as usual, didn't. People are voting for people that they know. People are voting for people who they've seen in their town, who've maybe helped them, who have been in the state legislature before. And that's another thing that doesn't necessarily seem to change. I guess I just wonder, though, in covering an election like this, when you have all of this chaos and turmoil at the national level in terms of politics, and then you see, here's what happens in Connecticut. Yeah, we basically just voted for the same people we voted for last time.
That's true to some extent. I mean, it's very hard for a statewide policy and politics news organization to cover 169 cities and towns and all the local races that play out there. And you're right, again, people do vote for the person that they're familiar with, unless something remarkable happens, generally. In my town of Old Lyme, as Mark mentioned, it's surprising to see that it flipped this year, and it went blue and voted for Ned Lamont. That was new for Old Lyme and Lyme. And I think that shows, again, the power of the incumbency. I mean, we did focus on the larger races, the Senate race, the U.S. Senate race, the 5th District race. They impact a lot of people.
When you look at that map, Mark, and you look at some of the towns that flipped, how much of that is about the power of incumbency? How much of that is about Ned Lamont, in some ways, having a good 4 years, including coming through a really unprecedented time with some leadership that some people questioned and leadership that a lot of other people appreciated? And how much of it is just due to a really bad Republican candidate who didn't do a very good job running in a way that differentiated himself from Ned Lamont?
Well, one of the things that was interesting is there was very little variation between all the Republican statewide candidates. No matter whether they spent $1 million, whether they spent $13 million, as Bob Stefanowski did, they all got 40%, 41%, 43%. That's something I haven't seen. Well, we've seen a little bit of that about the base Republican vote. But the fact that there was, that the opponent, Leora Levy running against Dick Blumenthal got 43%. And Leora Levy had no money for the general election. She won a primary very convincingly after Donald Trump endorsed her. But the fact that you had a Donald Trump supporter who is anti-abortion, getting 43%, and Bob Stefanowski, who described himself very much as in favor of reproductive rights and kept a healthy distance from Donald Trump, got the same 43%. So this was evidence that there was kind of a nationalization of our politics, at least on the statewide races. You do see certainly some individual results, particularly with state House districts where people can go door to door. There was a Democrat in Southington who won a Republican seat. It was an open seat, but a teacher named Chris Poulos, he won by 1 vote, but he door knocked on, I don't know, 5,000, 6,000 doors. And people in both parties, told me that this was evidence of how, at that level of a state house district, individual effort is still rewarded. You can meet enough people.
Bilal, William writes into us, to the point that Mark just made, though, to what extent did the Trump support suppress the Republican vote in the last 2 elections? If you look at the numbers the way Mark just did, the fact is that whether you're a Trump-supported candidate who wants to stand up on the podium with him or someone who wants to distance themselves, all the Republicans basically did about the same thing. Right. Does that have to do with the shadow that Donald Trump casts on the Republican Party in a state like Connecticut, where Donald Trump isn't a brand name that many people want to associate with?
Yeah. I think what's interesting also is that when you look nationally, one of the things that sort of helped Democrats and sort of prevented this red wave that lots of people were predicting was the way in which independents actually broke for the Democratic Party, which is really, in a way, unusual, that normally, the base sort of sticks with the party that they're going to support, but those independent voters are the ones who can really swing in either direction. In this case, they swung more than usual during the midterm election for the Democrats. I would imagine if you sort of get granular with Connecticut, unaffiliated voters probably did that as well here in the state. And so what happened, they looked at those 4 years of the Lamont administration, how, precisely as you said in the question about the way in which he responded to COVID and the effectiveness of getting Connecticut through that, some of the other efforts, allowing people to vote, all of the things that happened during this period. So for those unaffiliated voters, it might have been the case also, especially in those suburban rings, that they just decided, let's stay with the ship that's already sailing, rather than jump to the Republican Party and support Stefanowski, someone who they had seen 4 years ago, really knew what he stood for. It wasn't as if he sort of stood out, from Lamont. Just as Paz said, there were some similarities in terms of positions, lots of nuances on the positions. And so from that standpoint, it really didn't represent a kind of change, perhaps, that those unaffiliated voters wanted. And so whether Trump weighed people down or not, I imagine for that base supporter in the Republican Party, they still probably voted Republican, but I think it's the unaffiliated or the independent voters who I think we need to take a look at to see how they voted.
I bet you will see some of those towns go red in the municipals because it's a different voting pattern. So it's not that the Republicans have completely abandoned their party, but this election, as Sean Scanlon, he's a state rep who's the comptroller-elect. He said, we used to say all politics is local. Our local, not anymore. And I think that's what we saw here. So it was Trump, it was the Dobbs decision on abortion that I think drove a lot of this, and the fact that there were very, very little difference between these races.
But I think that's an important point, though Paz, that Beth, the Dobbs decision, whether or not Bob Stefanowski wants to, sort of thread a needle and say that he's pro-choice, but yet also kind of make some signals toward the right, that almost doesn't matter as much as the fact that probably Republicans, at least in a state like Connecticut, underestimated the amount of furor over that decision and what it might do to get people to the polls.
I think that's true, and I think his unclear statements or dismissive statements at different times during the campaign about the importance of that decision and whether or not it was an issue that mattered to Connecticut voters, did not help him. It did not help with women voters, probably, and their partners. And frankly, he kind of went back and forth at different times. He seemed to get to a point where he was very clear about his position, and then toward the end of the campaign, had this moment during a televised debate in which he sent another kind of confusing signal about that, saying that he thought abortion should be limited to the first trimester. I don't think that helped. And I do think that women were paying very close attention.
If this is more speculation, thinking about the future, we've now had a series of elections in which the Republicans have put up essentially a rich guy who is kind of out of touch twice, and he's been beaten 4 times in a row, essentially. If you had a Republican in the state, the same map, same electorate, a Republican in the state who basically came out and was very clear, I support a woman's right to choose. I have no interest in talking about any of the social issue dog whistle topics that are happening on Fox News, having to do with transgender athletes, having to do with any of the things that people want to bring to the election that don't really matter to a lot of Connecticut voters. Could that person win?
I don't think this year. I think Lamont's approval rating, you have to remember, Lamont's first year, he was dead man walking. It was one of the worst first years, I think any governor has had, in our lifetime. He completely botched the rollout of a tolls proposal in which he had reneged on a campaign promise. He said he would not introduce tolls on cars. If anything, would just be trucks. And in the end, he did. He proposed a very widespread highway tolling plan. And he did a very poor job of explaining what that would buy Connecticut, how it would improve commutes, how it would make Connecticut more attractive economically. He didn't do any of that. And at the end of 2019, he was one of the least popular governors in the United States. And
if you're going to have a bad year, have a bad first year, though.
Yes, sir.
Not a bad fourth year.
No, absolutely. And he didn't pull the plug on tolls until February of 2020. And then in March of 2020, COVID arrived. And the world changed. The state capitol changed. The legislature went home. And all of a sudden, the guy who really couldn't shoot straight his first year was this comforting figure on television every afternoon for some weeks, talking very plainly about, the challenge of understanding this and coping with it. And, by the end of that year, he had gone from the bottom 10 to the top 10. So never looked back. So I don't think anybody could have beaten him this year. But Stefanowski certainly could have had a more focused campaign. That was, I think, one of the criticisms that even Republicans had, that he never sort of hit a rhythm. He never had enough of a focus on the issue that all the polls showed might have moved people, which is the economy and inflation. And of course, one of the problems is always the question of what can one governor do regarding inflation.
Yeah, and I think too that, Governor Lamont was reassuring to all of these blue shoreline residents here that you see, because he didn't raise their taxes significantly. He was seen as one of them, and he had 4 years to prove it.
Literally is one of them.
It literally is one of them, and protected them in that way, and I think that those voters value that. And so the advantage that Stefanowski might have had on that score, he didn't really have. Lamont is not a scary, super progressive Democrat who's going to come after the rich. He's just not.
Yeah.
Fiscally conservative. But going back to the sort of first part of your question about Stefanowski getting the nomination, and I think part of it is he's running against the rich guy. And so I think, for the Republicans, in terms of putting someone forward, They wanted someone who could sort of match him in the financial arms race running for governor, who could spend as much as he would commit from his own personal money to the campaign. And so that primary did not have some of the kinds of issues you saw in other Republican primaries play out, because I think Republicans just wanted someone who had money and could run an effective campaign by spending a lot of money, which is what Stefanowski did. And so I think what's interesting going, in the future, I think if we end up with one candidate who is wealthy, then we're probably going to end up with another wealthy candidate who won't, draw from the public financing system to run for office. I mean, that may be dead at the governor level as it is dead at the presidential level. And that, so essentially what we ended up was with two rich white guys who were running for governor. And so that may be the future of Connecticut politics, even once Lamont steps aside, that, that's what the parties will be looking for.
Yeah.
Stefanowski showed a different way to win a nomination. If you go back 4 years, most of his competitors were looking at public financing, which meant you couldn't get any money until May. Yep. Bob Stefanowski was on television, in February that year. So, I mean, they really ran a brilliant outsider campaign to win the nomination. He never even went to the convention. And then this last time, he was the choice pretty much by acclamation at their convention. So yeah, I mean, to your point, I think public financing for the governor's race, may be a thing of the past, because you would have to live on a budget of $7 or $8 million. We won't see the final numbers for a while, but the last number we saw from Lamont was north of 21 million, and I mean, and I think it'll probably be closer to 30 million. And Stefanowski already has said he's over 13 million.
But before we turn away from the governor's race, Kyle, could you put up that other slide for us? The one where we were talking about support in the cities. So this is Ned Lamont's win margins got smaller in Connecticut cities in 2022. And I think what we're seeing here is the red places. This is not that Hartford, New Haven, and Bridgeport suddenly flipped for the Republicans. It just means that the win margins got just a little bit smaller. What does that tell you?
I think in many ways, this is kind of a return to the normal sort of pattern. A theory that I have about this is that the 2016 election really sent shockwaves, obviously, through our country and even around the world. And a lot of people were galvanized to get out there to really work hard to turn out voters in that 2018 election cycle. And so we saw a bump, and I generally describe that as a Trump bump, that it occurred not only in Connecticut, but it occurred across the country. As you know, I'm a part of I'm on the board of another nonprofit, and Common Cause, and what I was amazed is just how much the coffers swole, following that 2016 election. And so even in the nonprofit world, for groups operating in the democracy space, there was a lot more money coming into those organizations, a lot more effort around turning out the vote, getting into cities, door knocking, canvassing, talking with people, explaining the importance of voting. So that, I think, is in part reflects that, but it also may reflect also the way the Lamont campaign may have worked. Did they go into the cities? Did they have people on the ground knocking on doors, trying to turn out voters in the urban communities, or were they emphasizing the suburbs more? And that's a real question.
That was a concern from day one on this campaign. The Democrats in the city said there was an enthusiasm gap. Bilal's right, there was a bump in 2018, but this is far lower than what the cities did for Dan Malloy in 2010 and 2014. New Haven in particular, really delivered for Dan Malloy. His first race, he won by something under 6,500 votes, half a point. And if the suburbs had not suddenly got very passionate about Democratic candidates, this would be a far different event we're at tonight.
We're getting some questions here from people, and of course, people who are joining us for this live event can send in questions. We'll try to get to as many of them as we can. Laura asks, couldn't some of the suburban vote change from red to blue be reflective of young people and others moving here from the cities and other states and therefore more progressive, the country is indeed changing. And that may have something to do with it. These suburbs literally are changing. A lot of rural areas, I live up in Litchfield County, it's changing. There's a lot of New Yorkers here. How much does that have to do with it?
I can't say for sure, but I would guess that it has something to do with it. I mean, all the way up the shoreline, we saw an influx of new families moving here from the city at different points during the pandemic, and that really kept going for quite a long time. So, you know, it's now kind of easing up a little bit, but I'm sure we're going to have to wait to see all the final numbers. But yeah, I mean,
the boomer generation, you know, we're getting older. You know, kids are, you know, my kids are, you know, 30 and 32, and they're at a point where, you know, they're now part of this, you know, suburban cohort. And I think it has changed, you know, that, you know, I had Republican candidates tell me that, you know, their children are Democrats, mainly for the social issues. The national Republican brand does not work for that generation to a large degree. So you have that. And then, you know, as you said, the New York thing, I went door to door in Westport with a Democratic candidate for state Senate, and there were 3 of 4 houses in a row were people who had recently moved in from New York, mainly Brooklyn. But yeah, they bring their politics with them. So you have the New Yorkers coming in, you have that in Fairfield County, definitely. And then I think, you know, the questioner is right, that there is also that demographic change.
And you know, specifically, when you look at the inner ring suburbs around a lot of the urban core, they have become more diverse. And so, especially to the extent that people of color have moved out of the central city and moved into some of those inner ring suburbs, that also can have an impact on who is voting in those districts. And so if you look at that 10-year sort of look at the census, for example, one of the things you will see is that those inner ring suburbs have actually become more diverse as people move outside of the city boundaries. They're still close to the urban core, but they're now populating those inner ring suburbs more than they used to.
Just quickly, Mark, what does this mean for the next Lamont administration? Already we've seen some changes in his office. What sort of mandate does he think he has to do specific things now? He's out of a crisis for the most part. We are not done with COVID, but we are largely done with COVID. Now what for Ned Lamont?
Well, we're going to find out exactly how tough Lamont is or isn't in dealing with a legislature that is now even more democratic. There's a labor movement that's active in the legislature. There were, 2 more labor people elected to the Senate. Lamont put down a marker the day after the election and said, I don't want to hear anything about new taxes. I want to focus on growth and opportunity. And he'll have a struggle with his own party. In my mind, Lamont is Connecticut's Charlie Baker. He is, he's a social moderate to liberal on many things, but a fiscal centrist. He has been supportive of labor on some key things, a higher minimum wage. It's going to $15 next year, and then it's going to be indexed going forward. So it'll never be a political issue again in the legislature. He did paid family and medical leave. He signed a captive audience bill, which drives the business community crazy. But there was a bill that passed the Senate last year that never came up in the House to provide unemployment benefits for strikers. That's going to be a hard one this year. So it'll be an interesting year to see Lamont really act as, I think, probably act as a check on the more liberal instincts of some members of the General Assembly.
But it is interesting. So our friend Kathy Flaherty writes in with a question. Does anyone think that election results on the local level demonstrate a mandate for issues like increasing affordable housing and increased funding for human and social services? So when you have bigger Democratic majorities in the legislature, but all these people also voted for Ned Lamont. You're at a little bit of an inflection point here, right? You're actually saying, I want my local representative, Beth, to go to the Capitol in Hartford and do these specific things. And a governor who I also voted for who's like, well, not so much really.
He hasn't really shown any great enthusiasm for, revamping the state's affordable housing laws or enforcing mandates on municipalities and taking away local control on some of these issues. And I don't see that happening in his second term.
Go, Bilal, please.
No, I was going to say, I was talking to the president of CBIA today, and that's one of their issues. So that's something in which the state's largest trade group, which has traditionally been very conservative, but that's where there's some overlap with the left. So that will be interesting. The business community, they want to see more affordable housing. They want to see more immigration. They want to see, H-1B visas. They really, it's enlightened self-interest, but it is an area in which there's some overlap now with the left.
Yeah, they also want to see lower taxes. They probably could have had a conversation with
actually,
Bob
not really.
Stefanowski.
They're not pushing that. I mean, Lamont mentioned that at an event, and that was something that's not on their wish list.
Yeah.
Actually, is not lower corporate taxes. They're actually
I need to take a look at their updated wish list. They've had the same one for years.
But I think this battle that may occur with some of the more progressive members of the party in the legislature could be really interesting. Obviously the coffers swole during the pandemic because the stock market really blew up, right? And the rainy day fund got really large, right? And so I think what will probably happen is that these new members may come in and say, we need to make those social investments. We need to spend money, in our cities, building up the infrastructure, providing social services. And so it'll be interesting to see what that tug of war will look like between the governor who is more fiscally, exactly, is playing out. Exactly.
The heroes paid, but they realize that the money that was promised to the frontline workers is not enough to offer more than a couple $100s. So that's something that we're going to see play out even before they come in January. That's going to be something they're probably going to chew on in a special session later this month.
We do have one question just came in from Bryce, and I think I already know the answer to this, Paz. You've touched on it earlier. Any changes to tax policy at the state level next year? It's going to be a fight between lawmakers in Lamont on some issues. Anything happen with taxes?
Well, I mean, the stuff they're already talking about is continuing the gas tax holiday. The Republicans are going to see if they can, if there are any voting blocks among the Democrats to sort of build support to do something to get rid of the highway use tax that's supposed to take effect in January. As the Republicans are fond of saying, that was the governor's consolation prize for not getting tolls. But that's supposed to take effect in January. And with inflation high, there is an argument, do you want to do that now? The governor has been very careful about keeping an eye on the Special Transportation Fund, which as gas prices went crazy, it did produce more tax revenue. So it did take some pressure off that was there in 2019 when he put out his tolls plan. But so you'll see that. But the other thing that, the other dynamic here is that the Democrats now, particularly in the House, they represent, the richest and the poorest elements of Connecticut. And so that will be some of the tension in the Democratic caucus in the House and the Senate as to how you meet the needs of very different constituents in Connecticut.
I want to move to some of the other races and some of the other results because they are fascinating. The Senate race where a Trump-endorsed candidate got fairly handily beaten by Richard Blumenthal. In some ways, Beth, I guess it echoes some of what we said before. There's the power of incumbency. It would have been very hard to unseat Dick Blumenthal. But instead of a candidate who's sort of fumbling to try to find a middle ground and appeal to Connecticut Republicans and also appeal to centrists, they went with Lenora Levy, a Trump-supported candidate, and that had almost exactly the same result. Was there any surprise in that for you?
I don't know that I would say it was a surprise. I didn't think she was going to be a successful candidate. I was surprised that she beat Themis. That did stun me a little bit. Even after Trump endorsed her, because I didn't think that the Republican Party was necessarily going to go that direction. But, you know, there was no way she was going to beat Dick Blumenthal. I mean, he's got such huge name recognition in Connecticut, and he's been around for a million years.
And there was probably no chance that Themis Claridis would beat Dick Blumenthal either, but it would be a very different sort of...
Would have been a different conversation for
Yeah.
sure. Yeah, and it might have given Republican voters and independent voters more of a choice. I mean, Themis is, you know, an able politician, and she was very pro-choice, and she'd been in the legislature for a long time and really understood Connecticut and had some name recognition. So, yeah, might have been a tighter race.
Yeah, and I know, Bilal, this is something that's interesting to you too, the idea that the way that the parties are structured, the way that the primaries are structured, allow Connecticut Republicans, once again, to run a candidate who is going to be less appealing in the general election. This has as much to do with the way the party runs itself as anything else, but it is still fascinating that this is the outcome.
I mean, it's the nightmare scenario for party leadership, right? You have these primaries that draw out the most energized part of your base, right? And the Democrats have this situation as well, but not the way the Republicans have this potential problem. This was something, you know, when Levy got the nomination, of course, this occurred in many other states across the country where more far-right candidates won the nomination, but they weren't electable in the general election. And so whenever we say the Republican Party putting forth, I think it's a tricky conversation to have, because I think the establishment wants a particular kind of candidate, and then the base wants another kind of candidate, right? And when you have low turnout for primaries in, what is it, August, you've created a problem for yourself, right? The people who show up to actually vote in that primary tend to be the people who are the angriest, who are full of perhaps the most grievances, and also the ones who are loyal to a person like Donald Trump. And so as a result of that, you get this kind of an outcome. And at that point, what do? You've got this candidate. You can either support the candidate, put money into the race, put resources into the race, or you can take a loss and just say, we'll get them next time. And to some extent, that's what happened to her. She found it difficult to raise money. There wasn't a great deal of attention in the state on her race from the national level. A lot of the focus went into the 5th District, and where they thought it was a much more competitive race. Logan didn't have the same baggage that she had in terms of a Trump endorsement or someone who had been seen as being far to the right, and money came into that district, and Republicans at the national level, congressional committee, really thought that that was a race they could win.
Does that 5th District race point, Beth, to something that is different in the way that Republicans ran at least one of the many races that they had to run, in which George Logan was very successful and almost unseated Johanna Hayes?
Yeah, that race was a little different than I think some of the other races. I think Hayes missed some opportunities in the cities, particularly to run a strong campaign. I think Logan was an approachable, kind of easygoing, likable Republican candidate who made a real effort, especially in the final days of the campaign, to get out into communities, even when he knew he probably wasn't going to carry those areas. I think the 5th District has always been a little bit wonky in Connecticut. It's huge. It's weird. It's very varied. And so, I mean, but
Dankosky lives there?
yeah.
Well, but see, I don't. If you go back to the map, you just like, very quickly, Kyle, so you just throw up a map for us. There's this weird sort of claw.
Yep.
Yeah, you're in
and
the
so
claw,
I vote in John Larson's district in the first. It's sort of, you can't really see it, but Winchester up there, all that red. Winchester, that's our area. And then further out as the fifth.
But you're not.
We should be in the fifth, but that's,
Yeah.
the way that we've been redistricted
Yeah.
over the years.
What we haven't seen, what I haven't done yet is done a run on how Stefanowski and Levy did in the fifth. And I think when we see that, the statement of the vote isn't out. You can do this, but it takes computer skills that I don't yet have. But I mean, I know that Stefanowski did much better in the fifth than he did in the rest of the state. So it'll be interesting to see what kind of variation there was, if there was any, in the fifth district. Because the other thing that was weird this time, the Republican vote for Congress wasn't that, with the exception of the fifth, was not that different. In the first district, the Republican against Larson got 38%. The rest of the other districts, with the exception of the fifth, it was 40%, 41%. Again, we're seeing this kind of base vote almost as though it didn't matter who the candidate was. You had Leslie DeNordis against Rosa DeLauro in the third district, and Jamie Stevenson in the fourth. They both got about 40%, but Dr. Laser in the first, 38%, and it didn't matter. We're all still kind of struggling with, okay, what does that mean longer term? Are we just going to have this baseline Republican and Democratic vote in statewide elections? I don't know.
But again, for me, what would be interesting is if you're able to actually see, what the sort of independent or the unaffiliated voters did during this election. And I think they were sort of key in terms of which direction they swung in. You've got that base of support that both candidates will have, right? People who will turn out, no matter who you put up, they're going to vote for him because that's our candidate, right? And then the question becomes, can you excite these independents? Can you offer something that is really inspiring enough that they will break for you and not just go with the incumbent, who is the person who's most familiar to them, the one that they really know what their record is, and may not feel that they have a strong reason to make a change. And so I wonder about candidate quality, this time around, in terms of, how good the candidates were in terms of the kind of campaign they ran, the messages that they put out there about what they would want to try to do. But I think there was also baggage from the national stuff. I mean, to me, what was particularly amazing, and I sort of was trapped in this narrative as well, was on the economy as being the big thing, inflation. That would really drive it. But as Beth said, there are a lot of people who showed up at the polls who thought that abortion and other issues were not quite as important as the economy. The economy certainly, the national exit data showed the economy was number one, but abortion was a close second, and I think that was a part of this story that we missed. We talked a lot about the 5th District, we talked a lot about the economy. Certainly Logan, during the debate, he went on and on about the economy and inflation and the price of goods, but clearly there were young people, there were women out there who saw other issues that were important to them, that I think even the media missed, and certainly a lot of the pollsters missed in trying to figure out what was going on.
And a couple of people have asked us about the youth vote too. I mean, this is something that nationwide certainly showed up. A lot of young people showed up. Yeah. Still digging into the numbers here in Connecticut, but this is an increasing part of the electorate, Beth.
Yeah, absolutely. And going back to something Bilal said, I think also there's a hunger for stability right now among the electorate. Many people are exhausted by the polarization in our politics. They were frightened by the insurrection on January 6th. They do not want to support candidates who would bring that kind of chaos and uncertainty, and are looking for, kind of calm, reassuring language and people who represent their values. And I think that you saw some of that playing out here in Connecticut, and you certainly saw it across the country. Going back to your first question about something that surprised me, I guess this didn't surprise me as much as it relieved me that we didn't have any, election deniers here. We didn't have any battles over close vote counts. We saw candidates graciously accepting the results, George Logan being one of them. Yes, it was a close race. We looked at it. We accept the results. We've conceded. Mm-hmm. That was good to see.
Yeah, and speaking of voting, another thing that passed is our ability to now move forward to the idea that we will be able to have early voting in Connecticut. It is still, I think, shocking to many people in the state who were reading about that for the first time. That Connecticut is only one of 4 states that didn't allow any sort of early voting. We all got very excited a couple of years ago during COVID that we were able to cast absentee ballots in a way we'd never done before. And like, oh, this is actually kind of cool. I don't have to go stand in line with a bunch of people I don't know. I don't know, Bilal, this is a big thing. And obviously it doesn't take effect right away, right. But this is a big change for the land of steady habits.
I absolutely agree. And I think part of the problem is that we are the land of steady habits, and voting reforms tend to take a very long time to occur in Connecticut. But in many ways, this brings us out of the dark ages of voting rights in the sense of having the ability to vote early. I mean, Connecticut was one of 4 states that didn't allow that to happen in terms of in-person early voting. And so in many ways, we've just sort of joined the modern era when it comes to the opportunity to vote. And I think it is a really important leap forward. The way when I talk about this, I see this as one of many reforms that we need to catch up with. In many ways, we are restrictive in comparison to a number of other states. Sometimes, people will make the comparison with some southern states that actually allow things like early voting and no excuse absentee ballots, and say Connecticut kind of lags behind. Part of what I tell them, though, is that was because of the Civil Rights Act. That's the reason why those states do that, and Connecticut wasn't under that kind of radar. And so we have an opportunity, I think, to do something really important, which is give people the opportunity to vote early. I think of this as an issue of voice and representation, and so expanding access, giving more people the opportunity is a part of that. And Connecticut, I think, has taken an important step, but it's been progressively going on. I mean, we've got people on parole and probation now who are able to vote, parolees more recently. We've done other sort of things with regard to same-day voter registration. I mean, the list goes on, but there's gradual sort of changes, and as I say, we're moving into the modern era.
It is moving to the modern era, and just for people following along at home, Paz, then the next step is what? What still has to happen in order to get this?
The legislature now has to define how it will work. Will it be the weekend before? Will it be 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 30 days? These are the things that will be before the General Assembly. And there'll be a debate on that. You don't want it to be too modest, but you don't want it to be too far in front, because then if things change, you've had people who've already cast their votes, and that's its own problem. So that's what they will be debating this year in the General Assembly.
And if anybody in our audience here has any questions, we've got a microphone for you, and you can certainly ask your own questions. We had a couple people who were wondering about third parties. Alex asked about the Working Families Party arguably helping Congresswoman Hayes win her re-election. Lamont gained a large pool of votes, Alex writes, from the Working Families Party. Oz Griebel had in the past. What's the significance of third parties or third-party endorsements to future races, do you think?
The Working Families have been interesting. It's fusion politics. They have been really the player. But the endless debate, and I'll defer to the professor here because it's really the academics getting involved, is without the working family, the vote she got on the Working Families line, Jehana Hayes doesn't win. So the question is, do those people, if that line's not available to Jehana Hayes, do they not vote? Do they, that's always been the question on those. The Working Families Party is, early on, they would pitch themselves as a protest vote that counts. If you're voting for the Democratic candidate, because they're almost all cross-endorsed with Democrats, you are saying something. You are saying something about an agenda, because the Working Families Party, unlike all the other minor parties really, have a very clearly articulated agenda of what they want.
But I think the real benefit of that sort of cross-endorsement really is that the Working Families Party has members who are part of that party who will go out and
Not that
canvass.
many.
But they will go out and they will really work
They have
hard for the
staff, they
candidate,
have
right?
people,
So
yeah.
they go out there, they will make phone calls, they will knock on doors, they will. So for candidates, it's like a bonus, right? To accept that endorsement. I don't think people who walk in and who circle in the dot for the space for the working families would not vote. I think they would have voted Democrat but I think what happens is that it allows the party to have a voice in the political system because from their perspective, the party really represents their interests, the kind of issues that they want to push, to support working families, to do things like raising the minimum wage. So they're doing a lot of work at the legislative office building. They're, talking to elected officials, trying to encourage them to support particular pieces of legislation, a more progressive sort of agenda. And they offer the opportunity, even if they're not members of the party, they still have people that they're able to mobilize to get out there to knock on doors. And so the impact can be even larger than just how many people are actually registered members of the party.
In 2010, if you're voting for Dan Malloy on the working families line, you were voting for a higher minimum wage, right? That was quite clear. And that's what Dan Malloy
and sending
delivered.
a message to Malloy.
Absolutely.
That there are people out there who believe that the minimum wage should be higher.
Something you mentioned earlier, Bilal, and as we were talking about that map earlier, the number of races that go uncontested. I know you've been working on campaign finance stuff for a very long time about how you can get money into the hands of candidates so that we can have more competitive races. As you start to see more uncompetitive races once again, a couple years after we've been able to get money into candidates' hands, what do you see there? Is there waning interest in this type of publicly financed campaigning?
There are probably many levels to this problem, and I'd be interested also in both of your perspectives on this as well. I mean, it's disappointing to me to see so many races in which there isn't a candidate who's running against, the other candidate, that, these people are running for office and not facing any opposition. Certainly the creation of the public financing system here in Connecticut was sort of predicated on the idea that it would create that opportunity for example, people who didn't have friends with deep pockets, didn't have the sort of network of people to be able to raise funds in the way it had been done in the past, that they would have access to this pool of money and that they would be able to run for office. We were told, and I was a part of the groups that worked on this, that it would create opportunity perhaps for people who were single parents or people of color, more women, to have an opportunity to run for office. So this is really disappointing to see so many people who are not faced by a challenger when there is money that is available that could allow them to run a credible campaign at the local level, but they're not in those races. And so I think it's something that needs to be examined. I think the other part of the problem is that we need the political parties also to cultivate, people to run for these offices rather than just throw their hands up. And the final thing I'll say, part of this problem also is about redistricting. We are creating districts that are really not competitive. And as we talked earlier about this before the show, I mean, for me, I'm a big proponent of citizens commissions creating these districts rather than leaving them in the hands of partisans. We have a good example of how that changes the game in Michigan, in which voters voted for a citizens commission to create the districts. And as a result of that, in that state, the Democrats, for example, were able to flip both the House and the Senate in that state. And it's not a partisan argument, it's about this better reflects the community in Michigan where those districts had been drawn up in a way that they were gerrymandered, and it really prevented really competitive races from occurring in the state.
But one of the hard parts about that, Paz, of course, is you look at a state like Connecticut that's so overwhelmingly blue, all the state officers, everyone in Congress, the both houses of the legislature. What is the incentive of Democrats in the state to change anything about a system that makes the incumbency for them so very, very strong?
Well, a couple things to keep in mind. It wasn't that long ago that the Connecticut Senate was evenly divided, 18-18. And Connecticut's redistricting, it's a bipartisan legislative effort, and then if they fail, it goes to another commission. But it is bipartisan. The bias is incumbent protection. That's how they do.
On both sides.
On both sides.
It's
No,
both
yeah.
sides. It's both sides.
No, absolutely. For example, to try to help Ryan Fazio, the Republican state senator in Greenwich, they made a nearby district that had been represented by a young man named Will Haskell, who had taken it away from the Republicans. It is now a solidly Democratic district because, to redraw the lines in that very congested corner of Connecticut, that's the result. But that's always how it's done. The bias is to protect the incumbent, and there are competitive seats. In the Senate, you had 4 Republicans who were elected this time with less than 51% of the vote. You do have, there are, competitive areas, but to Bilal's point, the idea that we had 39 uncontested House seats out of 151 is alarming because public financing did take care of the money part. It's really, that's a level playing field. But, you still need to have a sense that you can prevail in a district. And there are people who will prevail against party registration because, particularly at the House level. But again, there were 39 uncontested House races, and that, that's not good for democracy.
That is not great for democracy. Maybe we can end on a slightly more positive note, I suppose, maybe, Beth. But I mean, as we get this election in a rearview mirror, I mean, what are the big Connecticut issues that you're looking ahead at? I mean, we spend so much time, we spend 4 years cycling around to a governor's race and trying to think of all the various possibilities for what could happen and trying to game it out. And now it's in our rearview mirror, and we have a Connecticut that, as we said before, looks an awful lot like the Connecticut that we had earlier. What are some of the big issues that you're going to be watching as we head into this next legislative session?
Schools, education. I think we've seen nationally and in Connecticut some pretty troubling trends in terms of not just test scores and learning outcomes, but also mental health outcomes for our kids, and how the state grapples with that, and whether or not the legislature and the governor can get their hands around some solutions. I think we still have a huge problem with housing and affordability in this state. It's not going anywhere. And there's some really, really legitimate issues that need to be tackled in that arena, and on both sides. I don't know, what do you think, Paz?
Well, crime is always something that they play with, and it was an issue in the campaign. It was not, the statistics are pretty clear that crime is not rampant and out of control, as Bob Stefanowski said, but it is an issue. It is a concern. Some of it is inconvenience, people who lose their catalytic converters, soda, and so crime is certainly an issue, and there's always a need to sort of tweak what the public policy is. Connecticut made some significant policy changes about sentencing, about decriminalizing certain things. And it doesn't mean that was wrong. I think there's a consensus that overall that was a good approach to really end the era of mass incarceration, particularly for nonviolent drug crimes. But it's something you need to continually look at and tweak. And one of the challenges will be, can they do it without it becoming, this kind of partisan show? Can you really have a serious adult conversation that's nuanced about, okay, are we really handling juveniles the right way, as opposed to just blowing it up and going back to something more punitive? I mean, Trump the other night when he announced, he was talking about, death sentences for drug dealers. It's like, come on, let's have a real conversation. All this stuff should be continually looked at, but there will be, they will look certainly at taxes. We'll see how it develops. The governor, again, is trying to keep the brakes on any new taxes. Connecticut still, growth is slow here. It's been a problem for 20 plus years. And the challenge will be, can labor, can the business groups, can they agree on certain things that are going to make this state more attractive, places to work, and can we get more labor? We have 100,000 jobs going wanting right now. It's a nice problem to have, but it's still a problem.
Yeah, but Bilal, how about you?
I'm not sure that Lamont will sort of be a criminal justice reform kind of. I think Malloy was much better on that issue itself. Yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah, but I will say, everything that was just said. The one thing I will add, as I watched a lot of the debates occur, all of the Democrats bragged a lot about the Biden sort of accomplishments, and whether it's infrastructure, money, and other things. So I think it will be interesting to see how that actually plays out here in the state of Connecticut. I mean, they all talked about, what they brought back to the state, what they've been able to get, roads and bridges and, internet connect. I mean, there was a long laundry list of sort of, and a very expansive view of infrastructure, for example, and other things. So it'll be interesting to see how the Mirror and other sort of press in the state really sort of drills down to see what this actually looks like in the state, and does it really change things, in terms of helping people with access to housing, or building, affordable housing. So it'll be interesting to see what those connections will be.
One big issue is going to be, will they renew the so-called fiscal guardrails that were established in 2017. The volatility cap, they used bonding covenants to kind of enforce those limits. Those rules expire this year, and there's going to be a pretty, I think, lively debate about that. The governor is certainly on the side of renewing them. Some of the Democrats think they're too restrictive, and they would like to spend more money on needs that they have identified.
Hey, Beth, I'll just leave with this thought. Betsy writes us a question here, and you touched on this earlier, sort of feeling good that we came through an election cycle without any huge problems with election deniers. Betsy asks, the need for greater civility in politics has been raised for several years. Do you think that the candidates in this year's election were more or less civil than in previous elections? I don't know, I sort of get the sense, at least in Connecticut, that it felt like a more civil election than the one that we've seen, certainly dating back to 2016.
Yeah, I was a little surprised by that, actually.
Positively, isn't that nice?
Positively, yeah, it was a nice surprise, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I thought that for the most part, they stuck to issues and not, attacks on each other's character. I mean, some of the ads were a little disappointing, but the actual debates and interactions between the candidates seemed to be fairly civil.
The ads are disappointing, and also the number of texts that I got.
Yes.
Very disappointing, and the quality of the texts. So I'd like to sort of change that. That's something we can work on for next time.
There was an astonishing amount of false advertising this time.
Yeah.
That's true.
Well,
On both sides. And in the governor's race in particular, I thought the tone was harsh. You had Bob Stefanowski basically accusing the governor and his wife of being corrupt.
Oh, yeah.
Is that any harsher than it's been before? I guess it just didn't feel that much different than what we've seen in the past.
People will play hardball in those races, certainly. Yeah. And when you compare it to 2016, I was going to say, don't use 2016 as a baseline.
Well, I guess that's true. We should never use 2016 as a baseline for just about anything. Yeah.
I tell you, as a political scientist, this is light work compared to the early 1800s. I mean, so those elections were a lot worse.
Well,
they say nice things now about
this is always good. It's always good to have a political scientist on the panel, because you always know that you can get that the long view perspective.
This not even close.
Our political scientist, of course, Bilal Sekou. He's an associate professor of political science at the University of Hartford, a member of the Mirror's board of directors. Bilal, it's always good to see you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks also to Mark Pazniokas, the Capitol Bureau Chief. Thank you so much, Paz.
Always a pleasure, John.
And thank you so much to Beth Hamilton.
Like the beard.
Yeah, I know. I got this from you. The executive editor of the Connecticut Mirror is Beth Hamilton. Thank you so much, Beth.
Thank you.
I want to thank everyone who made this possible. Kyle Constable, Gabby DeBenedictis, Claire Dignan, publisher Bruce Putterman, and the entire staff of the Connecticut Democracy Center. Obviously, if you've been watching this, you probably know about the Connecticut Mirror, but let me just tell you something about the Mirror. The Connecticut Mirror at ctmirror.org, it's a nonpartisan, nonprofit news organization. And what that means is We need your support to actually do more work, not just like this, but also all the great work that Beth and Paz do on a daily basis and all the other great reporters. I should say that if you want to make a donation to the Mirror, you go to ctmirror.org, you click on the big donate button. The donations are being matched dollar for dollar until December 31st as part of Newsmatch. This is a way that we can make your dollars go just a little bit further. So please make your donation today to the Connecticut Mirror, ctmirror.org. And before December 31st, it will be matched as part of Newsmatch. Thank you so much for watching. Thank you for supporting the Connecticut Mirror. And good night from the Old State House in Hartford.